They told me to kneel and beg for a real weapon as laughter rolled over me like surf, so I raised my bow instead and said I already had one, and when the colossus charged I drew and loosed and the arrow vanished into the light while 10 billion viewers held their breath and the laughter snapped in half. By the time the echo of the laugh died, the arena lights had finished mapping me. A human silhouette blinked on 1,000 screens, an outline with a narrow bow and a quiver that looked quaint beside the chrome forests of cannons. I could feel the broadcasts rifling through my biography the way pickpockets test a pocket. I was introduced as Darian Holt of Earth, species baseline, respiratory rate elevated, humor rating unpredictable. That last part caused a second pulse of giggles from the stands that stacked to the sky like a tuning fork. There were 7 moons above, each one banded with sponsorship banners that sold pocket stars and edible gravity. I tasted dust and something sweet, like electrostatic sugar. Someone behind me coughed, and I felt the deliberate disdain of a handler who did not expect to be handling anything more important than a loser. The rules of the intergalactic war games were delivered in a cheerful voice as if explaining a children's show. The announcer promised fair play, then displayed the list of allowable weapons, which included 3 variants of Sun Launcher and a device politely labeled the Aura Disruptor. There was also a final line that made my mouth curl. Traditional arms permitted at user risk. Traditional was code for hopeless. Traditional was a bin you kicked at the end of a garage sale. The camera drew close enough to show the nicks in my bowstring. You could hear the crowd lean forward to enjoy a good embarrassment. The arena floor gleamed, an intelligent surface that shifted for drama, raising ridges that threatened to trip me, smoothing to mirror finish when it looked best for the home systems of the sponsors. I had trained to ignore sound, but you cannot ignore the laughter of 17 species when they have paid for it. One of the reptilian delegations wore tuxedos. Their translator orb flashed colored jokes that arrived on a delay, so every punchline came twice, once in light and once in sound. A cluster of helium breathers from the Sapphire Crescent sang a taunt that would have been cutting if it had not sounded like a birthday balloon deflating. I allotted a small portion of my mind to cataloging them, because pettiness is a renewable resource. The rest of me walked to the center stripe, set my boots on the mark, and rolled my shoulders until my spine decided to cooperate. I kept my gaze on the arch that would open to release my opponent and let the ridicule pass over me. It did not matter whether they laughed. The bow still bent when I pulled it. The arrow still flew when I released it. The old physics had not filed a resignation letter. On my first night off Earth, an engineer from a moon of core showed me a rifle that calculated the future position of a target. He said, "Your bow is a museum piece since it cannot think for you." I said, "Excellent, then it will not argue when I aim where I should not." That memory returned now like a penny we throw into a well for luck. I rubbed the fletching of the first arrow through my glove, feeling the tiny grooves my allies and I had carved into it in the ship workshop. We had blurred the line between instinct and instrument. To the audience, it was still a stick. Good. I like being underestimated. It is the one gift rivals never mean to give. The arch opened with theatrical slowness, and the arena selected a blue that flattered my opponent. He was tall in the way that gives gravity anxiety, strapped into a frame of alloy plates that looked like cathedral doors. A herald called him the Bastion of Cray. He carried a gun you could use to level a city or impress a date. The laughter rose as the comparison became too obvious to resist, the kind of joke that writes itself. I wanted to join in. I am not immune to comedy. So I did the second best thing. I smiled. The Bastion read that as surrender, and raised his gun. It woke with a hum that made my teeth ache. My bow made no sound at all. The first volley was his. The arena deployed shield pedals to protect the front rows from splash. The shot turned the air into a storm of eager particles. I dropped to my left and felt the heat's thumb swipe my ear. Somewhere a betting pool adjusted odds and then snapped them back when I did not vaporize on cue. I came up on one knee. Humor is a survival trait, so I told myself this was just a very aggressive round of target practice with confetti. The next shot came faster. He was painting the floor with predictive fire. His gun expected me to step where most beings would step. I stepped where it would be mildly disappointed. I knocked and drew. Breath in. The string creaked a tiny music that nobody else heard, the sound an oak might make when it remembers it used to be a tree. The bastion's armor had vents along the clavicle line and a slit beneath the jaw that a lazy designer had hidden with a flourish. I did not aim at any of these, not directly. My first arrow hacked the air and struck the far wall, a miss so public the crowd cheered it. The second shattered a camera wafer above the bastion, showering him with glittering shards. A roar of laughter returned. Earth had brought a clown. The scoreboard briefly assigned me a comic designation. I would have bowed if I had both hands. The third arrow I drew was a patient thing. I had filed the head into a weird tooth, not aerodynamic, a sin against beauty. I loosed and let it wobble out, a sad bird. It struck the floor at an angle that made even me wince and skip like a rock on a lake, once, twice, 3 times, each hop collecting speed as if the arena itself were a conspirator. The surface was smart, yes, but also proud, and I had mapped its pride lines during the warm-up when I pretended to stretch. The arrow kissed a ridge that only rises when a certain camera angle is active, took on a mean curve, and smeared the last of its shame against the bastion's greave. He laughed. It is always good to hear your opponent laugh, because sound is a handhold. The morning after the first duel felt less like a sunrise and more like the slow creak of a door no one wanted to open. I sat in a chamber that smelled of oil and incense, surrounded by the polite silence of alien attendants who were still deciding whether to treat me as a guest or a curiosity. My bow leaned against the wall like a loyal dog, and every time I looked at it I could hear the echo of laughter breaking into silence. The bastion of Cray had survived, patched together with medgel and dignity, but the story of how an earth-born archer had punctured his invincibility had already flooded across the 7 moons. Somewhere in the political heart of the galaxy, powerful beings were already whispering that Earth's odd entry might not be a joke after all. I was not invited to the council chamber that day, but I could imagine it. Rows of beings cloaked in colors that meant allegiance, debating whether what they had seen was skill or accident. Some insisted I had been blessed by chaos, a fluke arrow. Others argued that any species capable of producing such precision with primitive tools deserved study, or fear, or both. Somewhere in that mix was Kael'tor, the galaxy's darling duelist, whose laugh was sharper than any blade and whose pride had been bruised not by defeat but by the mere possibility that he might someday stand across the arena from me. I had not yet met him face to face, but I had heard his voice echo through interviews, promising to crush the Earthling with elegance, and I could already tell he was the kind of enemy who thought rivalry was a form of theater. I was given hours of freedom before training resumed, so I walked the inner corridors of the arena complex, a maze of metals and glowing symbols that shifted underfoot. My reflection followed me along the walls, stretched and distorted. Vendors sold souvenirs shaped like rifles, plasma coils, and tiny figurines of alien heroes. Somewhere, a merchant had already crafted a wooden toy bow with my name burned into the side. I almost laughed, because if there's one thing you can trust the galaxy to do, it is to turn even disbelief into merchandise. As I lingered at a stall, a group of children from a methane-breathing colony spotted me. They whispered among themselves, too shy to approach, until one finally asked if my arrows really curved through space. I knelt, placed one in his palm, and said the trick is not that they curve, but that you must know what you want them to do before you let go. The child grinned and held the arrow like it was a relic. The laughter of yesterday had already begun to change flavor. Training that day was a mixture of frustration and humor. The arena provided me with a practice space populated by holographic targets that sneered whenever I missed. I drew and released until my fingertips throbbed. The arrows I had modified with alien alloys flew faster, their tips glowing faintly from the energies they absorbed. One shot split a target's sneer perfectly in 2, but the recoil sent me sprawling onto my back, which earned a round of chuckles from the attendants. I sat up and grinned back. Better to laugh with them than to let them laugh at me. By the end of the session I had learned which metals sang with the bowstring, and which made it sulk. I found myself treating the arrows less like ammunition and more like instruments in a half-built orchestra, each one capable of a different tune if I could only learn the music. The real entertainment began when Kael'thor himself visited the training floor. He walked in wearing armor polished to a mirror, and a cape that fluttered even though there was no wind. He carried a blade that hummed as though it enjoyed its own presence. Every step he took was a performance, a reminder that the galaxy adored him not just for his victories but for the way he delivered them. He circled me like a cat pretending it had not yet decided whether to pounce. He called me quaint, an antique, and asked whether I had plans to open a museum once the games ended. I told him I already had one, and he was standing in the exhibit. The attendants gasped, partly in admiration, partly in fear, because Kael'thor's temper was legendary. He merely smiled, though it was the kind of smile that meant he had already begun plotting my humiliation. Our exchange did not end there. He asked to see my bow up close, and when I hesitated he lifted his hands in mock surrender. Against my better judgment I let him. He handled it with exaggerated care, turning it as though he were appraising a trinket at a market stall. Then he drew the string with no arrow, let it go, and made a show of how weak the snap sounded compared to the roar of his blade. The crowd of onlookers laughed, though their laughter carried less conviction than yesterday. Kael'thor handed it back and whispered that in the next match, when the galaxy watched, he would see to it that my bow and I were reduced to footnotes. I smiled and told him I looked forward to helping him spell the words correctly. His laughter rang out, theatrical, but I could see the small crease at the corner of his eye where annoyance lived. They named the first match a feast, and I was to be the garnish. The beast of cinder waited behind a gate that sweated with its breath. The arena crafted a floor of red sand to flatter its legend, then unfurled a sky the same color as fresh wounds. Vendors sold little plush beasts that roared when squeezed, and even the roar sounded kindly compared to the sound that came when the gate lifted. The creature shouldered out, a story made of meat, eyes the color of forged iron, a head crowned with plates that had taken honest starships to pierce on other unlucky afternoons. It looked at me the way a storm looks at a house on a lonely hill. Somewhere the broadcast overlay measured my heart rate and turned it into a graph that resembled a polite staircase. I knocked mud from the soles of my boots as if arriving late to a garden party. The crowd swelled with laughter that beat against my skin like rain. I drew an arrow, not the clever ones, just a straight-tempered shaft whose only ambition was to be honest. The beast tested the air and rumbled a sound that felt like a baritone chuckle. It leaped with a speed that insulted its size. The arena raised 3 dunes to force me into a poor position, and the commentators shouted advice at me like distant uncles. I ran along a ridge that moved underfoot as if it enjoyed the joke of my smallness and the beast's immensity. When it landed next to me, the sand rose in a halo and a claw gouged a trench where my shadow had been an instant prior. I slid, rolled, and came up with one knee buried and grit in my teeth. I fired one arrow at its plated brow, and it bounced with a noise like a spoon on stone. The laughter surged. I imagined this was how a street performer feels the first time a trick fails in public. The second arrow I sent low, into the muscular hinge of the foreleg where plates gave way to tendon. This time the shaft sank. The beast staggered and bellowed the sound of a train leaving track. The booing turned to surprise and then to the quiet that follows when an audience realizes they may have been wrong about the script. The beast came again, angrier, smarter. A plate on its chest parted for heat release, and I pretended not to notice the new wound it had granted me. I feinted left, and dropped a charge arrow into the sand to my right, the one whose alloy liked to argue with friction. The sand flashed to glass in a sheet the color of thunderheads, and the beast, skidding to adjust its course, found no purchase. It slid, a continent on ice, and my next arrow rode the glare to find the gap in its chest. The impact shuddered through it, through the floor, through me, a bell struck by a blacksmith. It fell with a reluctant grace and exhaled a long sigh that made me think of old trees giving up in a storm. The stands erupted. Somewhere in the upper tiers the vendors began stuffing the plush beasts into bags with less enthusiasm, and the children who had bought them stared at me as if I had rewritten the ending to their favorite bedtime story. I bowed to the creature without mockery and departed the sand, the hem of my tunic carrying a souvenir stain that would be difficult to wash but easy to remember. I barely had time to breathe before the second match was announced. The arena gloried in cruelty called dramatic pacing. Kale Tor stepped through a curtain of light that sprayed him with applause as if he required seasoning. He wore the same mirror armor, and the same smile that never reached his eyes. His blade hummed its vanity note. He tossed a single rose into the stands for effect, and the rose developed a social life in the air before vanishing into a riot of hands. He crossed to me and made a point of bowing deeper than necessary. He said that the galaxy would forgive my earlier fortune against the beasts because all theaters forgive their understudies. I told him that I would sign his blade after the match since it looked hungry for a real autograph. He clapped his hands as if I were his favorite comedian. The floor shifted to marble for him because marble flatters anyone who dances. He moved with a lightness that would have made gravity consider another career. His first cut cleaved a hair from my head with a whisper I felt through bone. My first arrow cut the ribbon from his pauldron and pinned it to a distant statue. We circled as the arena played a percussion line with the audience. He called out the names of his famous victories like a bard who has not yet learned that people prefer a new story. I answered by listing the names of the places on Earth where people taught me to shoot while the rent came due. Nairobi rooftops where clotheslines tried to tangle my elbows. New Zealand wind that liked to change its mind mid-flight. A wet Tuesday behind a deli in Pittsburgh where the only moving target was a bottle and the bottle had opinions. He pressed me with dazzling ferocity, his blade painting lines in the air that wanted to be calligraphy. I began to miss in ways that looked convincing. An arrow shattered on the floor. Another grazed his thigh armor and left a chalk kiss. He smiled wider, mistaken about who was performing. When he opened his mouth to deliver a practice quip to the cameras, I sent a blunt arrow into his ribs at just the angle required to knock wind from his lungs but not break his bones. He doubled, eyes wide, and for a heartbeat the blade forgot to hum. I stepped in, knocked another arrow as if we were partners in a dance, and with a flick of the string I undid the clasp that held his cape. It fell in a velvet collapse that the crowd enjoyed far too much. I could have killed him then. Instead I leaned close and told him that the audience loves humility almost as much as blood. He swung with fury at last and the strike would have parted me, except I had learned the rhythm of his pride and stepped where his story did not expect me to be. My arrow pinned his blade to the floor through the guard. He wrenched it free, but the applause had shifted tone. The match ended by referee intervention under the pretext of show preservation. He left with dignity but also with the realization that laughter can turn. The council chamber did not open its doors to the likes of me, yet I could hear the decisions in the way the corridors breathed. Guards moved faster, their helmets shifting to darker tints. Servants carried trays without speaking, as if words themselves had become contraband. I understood then that the laughter had curdled into fear. A man with a bow had shaken a spectacle that had been designed to prove the superiority of the galaxy's advanced species. If Earth could arrive with wood, string, and stubbornness and walk away victorious, then the foundations of their pride were flawed. And flawed foundations are dangerous, because once people begin to wonder about them, entire empires can crack. So the council decided, in its polished language, that balance must be restored. In simpler words, I was not supposed to win again. The first sign of their plan came with the revised rules. They announced a new round where combatants could be paired against multiple foes at once. The language was decorated with phrases about fairness and excitement for the audience, but the meaning was as clear as a spotlight. My next match would pit me not against a single rival, but against three, each selected with surgical intent to break me. When the notice arrived, my handler turned the display over in his hands and asked whether I could forfeit without Earth losing face. I told him the truth. To forfeit would be to erase Earth from the games entirely. To fight would be to gamble Earth's reputation on my lungs, my hands, and the curve of an arrow. It was a cruel choice disguised as entertainment. He looked at me as though trying to memorize my face before the universe erased it. I spent the hours before the fight with the mechanic, my strange six-handed ally. He brought me new shafts carved from alien alloys and covered in inscriptions I could not read. He said the runes were nonsense, doodles meant to confuse anyone who examined them, because sometimes belief itself adds weight. We tested them on slabs of discarded armor, and when one shaft shattered on impact, the fragments spun with such fury that even the mechanic whistled. He called it a happy accident. I called it something I could use if the world tried to end me again. For every innovation we shaped, the mechanic reminded me with a laugh that the bow itself had not changed. It remained honest, perhaps the last honest thing in the arena. I nodded, though honesty is rarely a shield. Kale Tor appeared again, uninvited as always, and watched us work. His smile had lost some of its polish. I think he had begun to realize that mockery can curdle into reverence, and that my victories, however improbable, were stealing the attention he believed belonged to him. He told me quietly that the council wanted me broken, and that I should not expect the rules to save me if the match turned desperate. For a long moment I studied him, wondering whether he offered this warning out of grudging respect or out of a desire to see me stumble in fear before he killed me himself. His eyes betrayed nothing, but the fact that he said it at all told me something had shifted. A rival who warns you is no longer just a rival. He has already imagined standing beside you in another war. The match arrived like a storm that had been building all week. The arena floor reshaped into a maze of jagged stone, perfect for ambushes, perfect for making me feel like prey. My 3 opponents were called champions, though I suspected they had been chosen not for their glory but for the way their skills could corner me. One carried a chain of molten links that glowed with a hatred of distance. Another rode a beast half metal and half muscle, its body bristling with projectors. The third wore a lattice of drones that spun like a halo, each one humming with enough energy to cut through steel. The crowd adored the spectacle, applauding the unfairness as though cruelty were a festival game. I strung my bow and said nothing, because sometimes silence is sharper than threats. They came at me together. The chain champion tried to bind me, the links clattering like a laugh in the dark. I rolled across the jagged stone, loosing an arrow that split mid-flight, the twin halves catching the chain at 2 points and tangling it in its own fire. The champion cursed in a tongue that smelled like sulfur and fell back, his own weapon snarling around him. The beast's rider surged forward next, the creature leaping across ridges with unnatural grace. I drew a shaft with the runes and sent it spinning under the beast's belly. The impact shattered the arrow, and the fragments sang like glass struck by hammers. They burrowed into the creature's underside, finding gears and muscle alike. It screamed a mechanical hymn, bucked violently, and threw its rider into the rocks. The crowd's roar faltered, surprise tripping over their amusement. The drone master proved more dangerous. His halo shifted constantly, intercepting my shots with precision that made every miss feel personal. He advanced slowly, savoring the inevitability of it, as if I were a rabbit circling into a snare. I ducked behind a spire and breathed hard, my chest a furnace. I counted arrows left, counted breaths left. Then I remembered the mechanic's tuning click fixed to my grip. The arena floor hummed faintly beneath me, its vanity pulse at the edge of hearing. I waited until the click nudged my finger, then drew a simple arrow, no runes, no tricks. I loosed it high, letting it curve wide and slow, a lazy bird. The drones moved to intercept, their halo parting like a curtain. At that moment I drew a second arrow and fired through the opening, faster than thought. The first had been bait. The second was truth. It pierced the drone master's shoulder and sent him spinning, his halo collapsing into sparks that rained like broken fireworks. The announcement did not arrive as a blast of trumpets, or a roll of war drums. It slid in through the public feeds like a polite memo that just happened to end civilizations. By resolution of the Grand Council, Earth is designated a destabilizing influence, and a clear existential threat to intersystem harmony. Penalties and sanctions to follow. Security actions authorized. The words were clean and empty and merciless. I stood in the corridor reading them while the arena lights learned a new color that I had not seen before, a shade made for emergency and spectacle. Crowds pivoted from celebration to curiosity to hunger in the space of a breath. My handler went pale and whispered that we had angered not just a game but a government, and that governments tend to dislike jokes when they are the punchline. They came fast after that. Troop carriers like angry beetles nested on the roofs of the arena. Security gates sealed and resealed with an urgency that could not decide whether I should be kept out or kept in. The council claimed they were protecting civilians from a potential riot, then switched the feed to a panel of experts who explained why the riot would be my fault if it happened. Somewhere above the moons, new fleets adjusted their courses as if responding to a change in weather. The city of 7 moons had never liked the dark, but now its lights felt like interrogation lamps. I felt the bow grow heavier across my back, as if wood could absorb dread. The mechanic found me and thrust a wrapped bundle into my hands. He said he had finished the insisting arrow, then added that it was unwise to rely on a single miracle, so he had made 3 more applicants for the job. Allies arrived out of nowhere. A team of minor champions with a fondness for lost causes drifted toward me the way iron filings drift toward a magnet. They were not the grand names that earned laser signatures and perfume sponsorships. They were the ones who fought in the side brackets at bad hours for small checks. A 4-lunged swimmer from a methane sea who moved on land with careful determination. A silent duelist from a world that believed speech was a luxury that cost oxygen. A medic who had never won a match but had never lost a friend. And then Kael'Tor, resplendent even when trying to look humble, stepped from a shadow as if the shadow were his valet. He said the council had crossed from petty to unforgivable, and that he would rather lose to an archer than bow to a committee that feared surprise. I looked him in the eye and nodded once, and for a moment we were not rivals but co-workers assigned to the same impossible shift. The siege began when the council cut power to the lower concourses to herd us into predictable channels. They wanted to funnel us toward a security checkpoint that could examine and confiscate my equipment under the pretext of safety. The mechanic snorted and called it an audit for thieves. We moved against their current. I shot lamps above intersecting hallways so that glass fell in dazzling sheets, and scattered the drones that wanted clean footage. Kael'Tor carved our path with delicacy, never lingering in the floodlight, never striking a guard with more force than necessary. The swimmer carried 2 attendants at a time through gas-flooded corridors, immune to vapors that had been tuned to specific lungs. The medic pressed patches on wounded bystanders with a speed I envied and a kindness that hurt to watch. Somewhere in the building a riot did bloom, not of rage but of spectators who refused to be told that the show was over. Their voices rolled through the halls like a tide that had misplaced the moon. We used humor as a blade because panic dulls it. When a squad of armored troopers with stun batons rounded a corner and saw my bow, one laughed despite training, and the laugh made the others human again for a heartbeat. I complimented the batons and asked if they were a match set or if they bought them separately to avoid attention. Kael'Tor bowed with theatrical sincerity, as if greeting old friends. The swimmer juggled 3 breath canisters like a clown auditioning in a hospital. It was enough to make the squad hesitate. It was enough for me to knock and send an arrow that smacked a baton out of a hand and pinned it to a wall, humming in indignation. The boss shouted a command that sounded less like arrest and more like retreat. We slipped by with a wave and a promise to leave the place tidier than we found it. The council slid from containment to punishment. They ordered heavy units into the arena proper, and the doors parted to admit machines that had once been paraded down avenues on holidays to reassure citizens that doom was friendly. Giants of armor, walking archives of violence, each knee joint engraved with the histories of the battles they were designed to win. The crowd gasped, then cheered as if this were merely a bonus act before the main event. I stood on the sand where I had humbled a beast and a duelist, and weighed the wrongness of using a place of play as a place of war. Then the giants raised their weapons and the argument within me ended. The first giant lifted its gun, a barrel wide enough to drink the breath from a room. I loosed a pair of arrows in quick succession. The first struck the sand before its left foot and detonated a pocket of microbursts the mechanic had hidden inside the head, throwing grit into sensors. The second skated under the raised heel and flared a magnetic surge that clawed at the servos. The giant stumbled as though remembering a dance it had never learned. Kael'Tor darted in and carved a polite diagonal across the knee plate, shaving pride rather than steel, a gesture designed to irritate. The swimmer lobbed a globe of methane that blossomed into fog, and the medic used the cover to drag a wounded usher to safety. The second giant fired blind and struck the scoreboard, which screamed and died, taking with it the latest panelists loudly explaining my inevitable defeat. I drew the insisting arrow and felt its weight like a verdict. The head held a core that argued with energy fields until they forgot what they were supposed to do. The shaft was slightly crooked, which made accuracy more an act of belief than geometry. I could hear the tuning click purr in my palm as the arena floor hummed its vanity note, even here under sabotage. I let the arrow go. It stitched a wandering line through the air like a drunkard with perfect memory, struck the first giant's throat plating, and did not pierce so much as persuade. The shield there blinked, considered its choices, and decided to take a brief and ill-timed nap. The arrow slid under the lip of metal and kept whispering its case until the core of the machine heard it and dimmed. The giant knelt, confused, as if waking in a room that had been rearranged without permission. The crowd went silent, then exhaled in a shiver that felt like weather. The declaration that Earth was now an enemy did not feel like words read from a council broadcast. It felt like a door slammed in the face of an entire species. The proclamation appeared across every screen in the City of Seven Moons, carried on banners and chanted by announcers whose voices were usually reserved for sponsorships and scoreboards. The language was dressed in formality, as if legal vocabulary could soften the blow, but underneath the veneer was a simple message. Earth was too dangerous to be tolerated. I stood in the corridor watching the feed scroll, the letters sharp as knives, and understood that this was not just about me. It was about a world that had sent one unlikely archer into the games, and now that world would carry the weight of his arrows whether it wanted to or not. The crowd responded first with disbelief. Many of them had laughed at me, many had mocked, but even laughter had transformed into curiosity, and then into admiration. Now they were told to fear me, to fear my planet, and to rejoice at the punishment about to follow. The sound of their confusion was stranger than laughter, stranger than silence. Vendors packed up souvenirs of my bow, uncertain whether selling them now counted as treason. Children clutched plush replicas of the Beast of Cinder, and asked if the archer would still fight tomorrow. Soldiers in darkened armor moved in to secure the gates, their movements quick and impersonal. I was no longer a competitor in a tournament. I was an excuse for extermination. The siege began not with bombs but with slow suffocation. Power was cut from half the arena complex, forcing us toward a funnel of checkpoints designed to separate me from my bow. The council did not want me dead yet, not in a way that would look like an execution. They wanted me humiliated, contained, and paraded before they decided on the method of erasure. My small circle of allies gathered in the dim light of the training hall. The mechanic handed me arrows still warm from his frantic work, shafts coated with unfamiliar alloys that whispered when I touched them. The medic tightened a bandage on her arm and muttered that saving lives was harder when officials considered healing a form of resistance. The swimmer from the methane seas adjusted his tanks with steady patience, promising he could carry anyone through gas floods. And Kale Tor, eternal performer, leaned against the wall with his cape discarded and his eyes sharp, no longer the mocking rival but the reluctant partner of a man who had become the center of the storm. We moved through corridors heavy with the echo of alarms. Drones tracked us with lenses that glowed red as if embarrassed by their orders. I shot out a handful of cameras not to hide, because hiding was impossible, but to force the council to admit they were watching without control. At one junction a squad of guards blocked the way, weapons raised. Kale Tor stepped forward with all the elegance he had once used to court applause and greeted them as if arriving late to dinner. His voice rolled like a command wrapped in silk. I loosed an arrow that pinned a bat into the wall without touching flesh. The swimmer produced a cloud of methane mist that hissed and danced around their visors. By the time the guards cleared their vision, we were gone. Humor bubbled among us because humor was the only shield thinner than skin. Kale Tor quipped that Earth must produce interesting dinner parties if its people practiced survival with such style. I answered that his cape would have made a better tablecloth. Even the medic allowed herself a laugh, though it was sharp as a scalpel. When the council saw containment failing, they escalated. The great gates of the arena opened again, but instead of athletes or beasts, giants walked in. Machines built to remind entire worlds of their helplessness, plated in the symbols of past victories, their very steps an argument for obedience. The audience, still lingering in disbelief, gasped at first and then applauded, because applause is habit, even when the act is slaughter. The giants leveled weapons that had been displayed on festival days as if weapons became gentler when covered in flags. I drew an arrow and felt the bow hum with something more than wood and string. It felt like defiance itself. The first giant raised a cannon. I sent one arrow into the sand near its heel, and the mechanic's modifications turned the grains into a spray of glass that chewed into its sensors. Another arrow skimmed the ridge of the floor, bounced, and lodged in a joint, forcing the machine to stumble. The swimmer hurled a bubble of methane that burst into a haze around the machines. Kale Tor darted through the fog, blade flashing with theatrical cruelty, etching shallow scars into armor plates that glowed like offended suns. The medic moved calmly behind us, dragging civilians away from collapsing balconies, her hands faster than thought. The crowd began to shift, unsure whether they were watching a massacre or a miracle. The insisting arrow weighed in my quiver like a verdict. The mechanic had promised it would not ask, it would demand. I loosed it at the throat of the lead giant. It did not fly straight. It wobbled, then curved, as though choosing its own path. The shield shimmered around the machine, tried to resist, and then dimmed like a tired candle. The arrow slid into the seam, and the giant shuddered. Its lights flickered. It knelt as though bowing to a truth it had denied. The silence that followed was louder than any cheer. The audience, the guards, even the machine seemed to hesitate, as if the story they had been promised was no longer available. More units poured in, smaller, sharper, learning as they fought. But the arena itself began to resist the council's orders. It was a vain place, designed for spectacle, but even vanity has limits. The floor raised ridges in our favor, delaying soldiers, confusing the machines. Doors stalled just long enough for us to slip through. I sent arrows ricocheting off stone to find targets that thought themselves hidden. Kale Tor turned combat into choreography, each strike precise, each gesture a performance of defiance. The swimmer leapt through impossible gaps, laughing with all four lungs. The medic scolded wounded guards into lying still, while she patched them against their will. The laughter from the stands had changed entirely now. It was no longer ridicule, no longer amusement. It was the shocked laughter of people who realize the impossible is unfolding before them.